we had to discuss among your group a nonverbal message that you find confusing. And so Sarah and I are thinking of the emoji in texting with the crying and laughing smiley face. Like, yeah, it looks cute. And we said, oh, and the second question is describe the different interpretations about the message you discussed above. And so, I mean, somebody might just be like cracking up because they find something hilarious, and then also I kind of read it as something like a diss towards somebody, you know? Like how could they think that? Like, I'm crying. That's what I see it as.
Okay, wait, can you explain that further? I don't understand.
So, like, I don't know, it's like almost like making fun of somebody.
Okay. Okay, so like, okay.
With,
So it's like,
in a certain context, I guess.
alright. I would have never thought of it like that.
Yeah, I mean, some people might not take it that way, but I just kind of took it that way sometimes.
Alright.
And then silly and kind of dramatic.
Was that the use perception checking?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, so different nonverbal behaviors mean different things to different people. And so we just need to be aware of nonverbal behaviors and be gracious to people's use of them, essentially. So my junior year here at OBU, you guys can go back to your seats if you want.
You just want her now? Okay. I'll go over here.
Good job with those questions. You all got them all right. My junior year at OBU, I was able to conduct my own research in communication, specifically nonverbal communications. So I'm going to share with you my journey today in nonverbal behaviors. I took the info gathering and research class. And going in, I didn't know anything about a lot of theory. Communication theory, like nonverbal communication. And so in the class, we had to choose a topic we were interested in and essentially look at it from a communication lens, viewpoint. And I decided to, I visited, my sophomore year, I visited a chapel service at another university, and I noticed there was a distinct difference in the nonverbal behaviors from at their chapel that were in our chapel at OBU. And so I began a comparative analysis of the different behaviors, and after that research was finished, I continued the research, and now I am writing a senior honors thesis, and so the research is almost coming to a close, and I'm just going to show you all what I have so far. The title is Where Communication Acts Intersect the Soul. So it's essentially communication acts that we use in communication with God. And they intersect the soul. You can thank Dr. Ellis for that. So this was the I used 3 institutions in the study. So I studied a non-denominational institution, a Baptist institution, and a Presbyterian institution. And I did a comparative analysis of their chapel services. So this was the non-denominational institution. And this was the Baptist institution. And this was the Presbyterian institution. The purpose of my study was to shed light on these questions. The first question being, to what extent do nonverbal communication acts shape the worship context? Then to what extent are fantasy themes regarding worship behavior reflected among the students involved in worship leadership? I'll explain that further. And how is social identity theory, organizational identity, reflected in the worship behavior seen at the 3 institutions involved in the study? So these are the questions I asked in researching the differences and even the similarities within the chapel services. And the significance of my study is that the study pertains pertains to college-age students, and it's all in a mandated, required worship setting. So it's essentially having to do with 18-year-olds to 25-year-olds. Of course, they can be younger, and of course, they can be older, non-traditional students. But essentially, it's 18 to 25-year-olds, and they're going to college, and they're apart from their original family, their original hometown, and their original identity. And they're away from their family of origin. And so that's significant enough in itself. But then you put in the fact that they have a spiritual identity already. Whether they're involved in religion or not, they still have an identity. And most people have a spiritual identity, and this is a big part of who they are. So that's another reason why it's significant. And then the final reason, there are many other reasons, but the final reason is that in Protestant worship contexts, there's a set time for music and worship. And in many religions, such as Buddhism or what's another religion? Buddhism, Hinduism, what'd you say? Rastafari. Yeah, in all these different religions, they have a strict ritualistic, nonverbal practice that they do. And Protestants worship during this musical time. There's not strict nonverbal rules. Even in the Catholic, they have strict nonverbal behaviors that they need to abide by. And so that's why this is also significant. In my literature review, I looked at a lot of literature that was pertaining to social identity and nonverbal behaviors and just the effects of environment on nonverbal behaviors. And Bird was still, do you all remember him in your reading? He was in your reading. I saw it when I was reading like a nerd and was really excited. But he's the one who coined the phrase kinesics, which is body motion. And essentially, he said body motion always contains some type of meaning, no matter what. So you're walking into a worship context, or a student's walking into a worship context, and their body motion is going to contain some type of meaning. If they're sitting down, it's going to mean something. If they're standing up, it's going to mean something. If their hands are lifted high, it's going to mean something. And Johnson, he defined social identity, which is people tend to define themselves in terms of social categories, not as individuals. So a student walking into OBU, they define themselves as an OBU student. I socially identify with the youth ministry majors. I socially identify with the communication majors. So people define themselves socially. And then Rappaport, he was one of my new literature that I added this semester. He's basically said that environmental and social cues guide appropriate behavior. So when you walk in somewhere, you're going to base your nonverbal behavior, your nonverbal cues on what's going on. So that's the same thing that's happening in a chapel service, essentially. And these cues are decoded through enculturation and acculturation. Do you all know what enculturation and acculturation is? Mm-hmm. I didn't either until I read this. I had to Google it. Enculturation is you walk in and you judge what's going on based on how you were raised. And then acculturation is you are being molded into the culture. So that's acculturation. So you take what you know and what you see and you put it together to make sense. And I conducted 3 methods. My junior year, I did pilot focus group interviews, which was I went to the non-denominational institution and I had 5 students and I asked them questions pertaining to nonverbal behaviors, and I did the same thing at the Baptist institution. And then I interviewed Jernigan. He's my uncle, and he is internationally known. And he's also affiliated professionally with OBU and the non-denominational institution. So I interviewed him and I just essentially asked him questions about nonverbal behaviors in worship contexts, and then also questions pertaining to ORU and the non-denominational institution and the Baptist institution. And then I did a focus group interviews at the Baptist institution, at the Presbyterian institution, and at the non-denominational institution. And then finally I did a rhetorical critique, which is I took speeches that were given in the non-denominational institution and the Baptist institution that were pertaining to nonverbal behaviors, and I coded them for fantasy themes to see if those themes were discussed among the students at each institution. So my interview with Dennis, he essentially said that the non-denominational students were very outwardly demonstrative in their nonverbal worship. And then the non-denominational students, they came in expecting to worship. They came in knowing what they were going to do when they walked in, whereas the Baptist students didn't seem that way. He said that the leadership sets the tone, so whatever the leadership is doing non-verbally, so will the audience. They'll react and do the exact same thing that the leadership is doing. And then he also said that it has a lot to do with background. Many of the non-denominational students come from a charismatic church background. And in my focus group interview at the Baptist University, I showed them 2 7-minute muted videos. And I did this with all of my focus groups. I showed them muted videos of each of the other worship services. So they got to see what the chapel services were like in comparison. And then after I showed them the videos, I just had them comment. And they would discuss differences, similarities, and just their overall general impression. And most of the time, the topic was why they did what they did, why they were different, why they were similar, why this institution acted this way, and then why the other institution acted this way. The same thing for the non-denominational institution, and they all discussed their personal worship style as well. And the rhetorical critique, I'm still conducting that method, so it's not complete. So stay tuned. And then this is what I found. This is what I've found so far. This is going to get confusing, so I'm just going to explain it. So the non-denominational institution was the most demonstrative, then the Baptist institution, and then the Presbyterian institution. That's what was as a result of the focus group discussions. That's what the students said about themselves and about what they saw in the videos. An individual's background and understanding of what nonverbal behaviors in a worship context represent greatly influence nonverbal worship style. So many of the students in the focus group discussion, they all told of times in their growing up, of their own worship experiences and how they came to understand what certain behaviors meant. One in particular, a girl, she said that when she was 9 years old, there was another 9-year-old girl who was a friend, and they were in their church, and many of the individuals in the church were lifting their hands, bowing down on the ground, jumping, dancing, and they were confused. They did not know what was going on, so they went to the side by themselves and they discussed what each behavior meant on their own. And they said, well, when you raise your hands, it means this. When you bow down, it means this. So after they had defined what those behaviors meant, they were more apt to lift their hands and bow down because they had an understanding of what it meant. And then another story, one of the students at the non-denominational institution said that he didn't raise his hands in church, and his sister said, you have to raise your hands. And he said, oh, why? I don't want to. But then a pastor got on stage and said, this is why you raise your hands? And then he felt he had to raise his hands. Nonverbal behaviors in a mandated worship context are fostered by a person's prior worship experience and also by the environmental cues. So there are what seems to be implicit and explicit rules in any environment. So when you walk into an environment, if you feel like raising your hands is it's not a rule. You're not allowed to do that. You're more, even if it's not stated, you're not going to. And one of the focus group participants said that at the Baptist institution and at the non-denominational institution, you were almost forced to react non-verbally. You were either supposed to be really lively or you were not supposed to be. Nonverbal behavior in a worship context serves as an expression of social, personal, and organizational identity. So there's a gospel group at the non-denominational institution, and they often play during the offertory at that school. And in one of the focus group discussions, these students brought it up that when this gospel choir band got up, many of the African American students would stand up and run to the stage, socially identifying with that group. Another example of an expression of social identity is at the Baptist institution, you're more apt to raise your hands when you're sitting up close, and you're more apt to sit up close if you're involved in ministry. So roles, and then so there's a role that you feel you have to fill in each identity. And one of the girls socially identified with one of the schools in the Baptist institution focus group, and she put herself in position when she was watching the videos at the non-denominational and the Presbyterian institution, and she said that when she put herself in the Presbyterian institution, she was more apt to judge someone who went out of the social norm, who had lifted their hands, but she put herself in the non-denominational institution, and she wouldn't do that. She said she would be more apt to lift her hands. So in conclusion, this topic is one that's often taboo. A lot of people don't want to talk about it. They get very defensive when I tell people about my research topic. People start defending something, but that shouldn't be the case. And one thing that I found out in my research is that most people don't discuss nonverbal behaviors in worship contexts. But I think it's strange because in most Protestant churches, this is something that they do. This is a tradition. There's music and there's singing. So why don't we talk about it? And there's just a lot of confusion. And I asked the question, to what extent have you discussed nonverbal communication in worship contexts? To my focus group participants, and they said, this is it. This is the most we've talked about nonverbal communication in worship context. But they said that discussion did arise when at the Presbyterian University, there was a very outwardly demonstrative boy who would stand in the front, so they had to talk about it because it was outside of the social norm. So they had to discuss it. Just, is this right? Is this okay for him to be like this? And then the same thing happened with the non-denominational institution. One of the students took up almost an entire row, and it sparked discussion because he was dancing and going crazy in the worship context. So in conclusion, I hope that my study sparks more discussion in this area. It's important to be aware of nonverbal behaviors in any context, and especially this one in particular. So that's my goal with this paper. Do you all have any questions for me?
Does anybody want to speculate as to why it may be taboo to discuss nonverbal communication in the worship context?